Thanks for listening to the Media People Podcast, lively and insightful chats with the people who power the media industry. I'm your host, Victor Genova. For more episodes, you can go to soundcloud.com/mediapeoplepodcast, or you can subscribe on your favorite podcast service like Apple Podcasts or CastBox. Views expressed by participants are personal. I like to refer to athletes as reluctant media people. First and foremost, their goal is to dominate their sport. But with success comes attention, and with attention comes endorsements, speaking engagements, press conferences, and other media responsibilities. And this pretty much summarizes today's guest, Joel Dembe. A former #1 ranked wheelchair tennis player in Canada, Joel's represented his country at numerous tournaments across the globe, notably the 2012 Paralympics in London and the 2015 ParaPan Am Games in Toronto, where he brought home the bronze medal in front of a hometown crowd. He recently retired from competition and sits down with us today to chat about what it's like starting off as an athlete and then growing into his own personal brand.
Thanks for having me. It's good to reconnect. We haven't seen each other in so long.
I know. You've had quite the illustrious, we'll say, last 7 or 8 years, per se.
Thank you.
I wanted to start with where you are right now. Technically speaking, you are a retired athlete. You're what, 31 years old?
I'm 31 years old. I think you and I have the same month birthday.
I'm April.
Okay, I'm March. I'm turning 32 March 16th.
So you know what? You might actually be 32 by the time this goes live. Then,
yes, absolutely.
Per se. So you're 32 years old, and the word retired is officially associated with your life. Is that a weird feeling?
It is a very weird feeling to have because for me, and I've played wheelchair tennis for so long, and I think one of the unique things about tennis is you can say you're retired, but it's a sport for life. It's not like football or race car driving or any sport that you're either in or you're out. Tennis players are players that play up until their 80s, 90s. It's a sport for life. What I retired from was basically Canada's national team, which basically I was an amateur athlete, and I feel like I've retired from being an amateur athlete. That's not to say I can't play tournaments anywhere in the world. There's no stopping you from playing a tournament. It's tennis after all. It's open for everyone. But I've retired from the opportunities that are given to an amateur athlete in this country.
Would you say you're about a year into retirement per se?
Well, I retired just after the Toronto 2015 ParaPan Am Games.
So that's about 8 or 9 months then?
Yeah, exactly. So it still feels kind of raw. So I officially announced it in October 2015. And here we are in March, and the weather is starting to warm up a bit, and now
you're still in great shape. So you're in that position where you're like, I could pick up the racket and pick up where I left off.
Yeah, absolutely. But I still play. That's the thing. It's something that I feel is important, wheelchair tennis, to someone who has a disability, and that's to stay active. I think, when you're in a wheelchair and you've known me, for a very long time, you've known that I've always been active, and that's who I am. And just because I've retired from the competitive side of tennis, it doesn't mean that I don't want to play recreationally or play the odd tournament or do something like that. It just means it's not my full-time job anymore.
So let's run through some of your accolades then, because you traveled across the world, played in multiple tournaments. What are some of the accolades that stand out the most?
Why don't I start with the most recent and then sort of work my way back? So at the Toronto 2015 Games, I, along with my doubles partner, Philippe Bedard, we won Canada's first international medal in wheelchair tennis. We won the bronze over Team United States.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And Team USA at the time, they were the defending gold medalists, and we had just come off of a heartbreaking loss to Team Brazil, who ended up with the silver. And we bounced back. We came away with the bronze. We were very proud of that. I ended up hitting the winning shot, and I dropped the racket after hitting the winning shot, and I pretty much retired on the spot. So that was an amazing thing. I think it was the best thing that had happened in Canadian wheelchair tennis history, just to get that international level medal. It's something that it was an honor, and we both put in a lot of hard work. And then prior to that, obviously being at multiple tournaments and getting my ranking to #1 in Canada for the last 5 years was always a goal from the beginning, from when I first picked up the racket. Going to the London 2012 Paralympics, fantastic experience. London did a tremendous job running the games, and getting to represent Canada at those games was fantastic. And then even before that, getting to go to the 2011 Pan Am Games and and obviously getting to travel the world and having to see places like Turkey and South Korea and South Africa, all across the United States and Europe. I mean, I've seen the world in the last 5 years more than I ever thought I would, and it's been quite the amazing thing to say it's all over now, to be honest with you.
So let's go back to the beginning. Where did all of this start?
Well, I had always been involved in sports from the get-go. I was born with a spinal tumor. The spinal tumor was successfully removed, but it ended up causing me to have a partial paralysis. So basically, by the age of 6 or 7, I got my first wheelchair. And when most people are learning, all these different skills, running, jumping, hopping, I was doing all those things in a wheelchair. And I started to develop skills in elementary school, doing, track and field and playing sports with able-bodied, students. And I had some great gym teachers that looked at me and they didn't, they basically said, "Oh, Joel can do everything." And my parents pushed me. And so I started getting involved in a lot of sports at a very young age until I discovered wheelchair tennis at the age of 13. I was introduced to it by a former top Canadian ranked player, Frank Peter Jr. Frank had actually worked with my father for the city of Hamilton for a number of years. And when my dad discovered that, oh, he's a wheelchair tennis player, maybe I'll send my son to hit with him. And I took to it right away. And I think it was an eye-opening experience because at the time I was just playing sports with other junior, disabled players. And when I first saw Frank, what was remarkable about it was not only that he was able to hit the tennis ball and do all these cool things in a wheelchair, but he was completely independent. He was very very remarkable for me as a young kid, an impressionable kid, to see someone who was an independent adult. And I think one of the great things about wheelchair tennis that made it unique is that you can play the sport with able-bodied people. And so for all, throughout my childhood, I always wanted to play with my brother and my friends. I didn't want to have to do stuff separately. And I think one of the unique things about wheelchair tennis is that you can play it with someone who does not have a disability. That you would play if I was to play you, Vic.
You'd kick my ass.
Well, maybe, but I'd like to think so. But you would play with one bounce and I would play with two. And so the sport really works seamlessly, and that you can play it with everyone. And I think that's one of the unique things that I like to share about wheelchair tennis or tennis in general, is that it is a sport for everyone.
Tell us where you grew up then. As you mentioned, your father was working for the city of Hamilton. You're from the area?
I grew up in a very small rural setting in Flamborough. So if you know where Flamborough Downs is,
I don't know.
So basically, that's where racehorsing is. We grew up basically close to that. I went to Ancaster High School.
Okay,
you do know where Ancaster is.
Ancaster, no, suburb of Hamilton.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I grew up around that area, and I started training in the Niagara region. Went to Niagara Tennis Academy in Vineland. Great wineries around that area if you're interested. But I think one of the other reasons that was great about training and competing in the Niagara region is that it brought me to Brock University as part of the sports management program where you and I met.
And tell us about your time there at Brock. I mean, the program. What brought you to that specific program?
Well, I mean, first of all, what brought me to Brock University obviously was the sports management program. I'd always been interested in getting involved in the sports industry. At that time, I was progressing in tennis, so a lot of things were happening at the same time. I was an amateur athlete, but I was also learning about the sports industry. But what was really important for myself and my family is that Brock, being a relatively new school built in the 60s, is that it was very wheelchair accessible. It was very easy for me to get around to different parts of the campus, whereas you go to an older setting like McMaster and University of Western Ontario, not as accessible as Brock. So I think that's one of the great things about Brock University is how accessible it was for me. And again, that was the first time I'd moved away from home. And being someone in a wheelchair who, you're trying new things on your own, you're learning how to do, all these crazy things and gaining your independence. I think it was the right setting for me to be at Brock. But obviously, more importantly, being part of the sports management program, which introduces you to so many different facets of the industry.
And you find that probably made you a lot smarter as you became kind of like the sort of like your own brand, per se. We were talking about that earlier.
Yes. And I think one of the great things is learning about sport policy, because it was like, you're learning about all these anti-doping things, and you're learning about the funding system. Well, I was actually getting those doping tests eventually, and getting an education in sport funding, and obviously seeing a lot of the challenges faced as an athlete with that.
How did you balance school and tennis at the same time? Because imagine you started school, you're still doing tennis on the side, but your tennis career started to take off to the point where they were like, well, Joel, we've got another tournament for you. You were successful here. This is gonna proliferate.
I'm not sure you could say this is a regret, but I think I didn't pursue tennis hard enough in university. I think I really could have done a lot more. I had the support of Brock University, attending certain tournaments here and there. Most of my tournaments were held in the summer that I would attend. So basically, I would make it sort of like a spring-summer thing where, from September to, April, I'll focus on school. Maybe I'll train a couple times a week, but I won't make it my full-time gig. And I feel like if I had made it more of a full-time gig opportunity, I would have probably progressed further in the sport quicker. Whereas I think by the time fourth year was happening, that's when, wow, things are starting to happen. But, I kind of want a job. I kind of want to do all of the things that my peers are doing. So basically, when I left Brock, I went right to Sheridan for their marketing program, a post-grad marketing program. And then I got hired from there right into the financial industry. And again, wheelchair tennis was kind of like this back burner thing that obviously it was still a dream, but I realized, I think it took a while for me to realize, okay, you can't do this half-assed. You have to go full throttle. You have to dedicate your entire life to being an athlete. And I think that's what it takes nowadays.
So you left the job you had in the financial services industry, and then you went full-time into tennis. How did that go? Like, tell us how that progressed. Well, was it a lot of training, then the tournaments, or did you just jump right into tournaments? How did that go?
While working in the financial industry, this was the thing. I was attending a lot of tournaments. I was starting to go to like 12 tournaments in a year, knowing that I didn't have a lot of vacation time, but I would leave for a tournament on like a Wednesday night, get there super late. I would go to a place like Dallas, get into Dallas late, play a match the next morning, and then I would have to take a red eye back on like a Sunday night, try to get to work by Monday. In no way you can possibly. I was drained, both physically and emotionally. Just, you can't possibly prepare for a tournament properly if you just get there a couple hours before your first match. I mean, it's so a joke.
Would you say that probably wasn't the more successful portion of your career when you're doing that?
Exactly. So I think there were a lot of coaches and a lot of Tennis Canada administrators that had always stressed that, we need to see a little bit more dedication out of you. I think everyone understood the situation that, Joel's, pursuing his career. But, I think there came a point where I started progressing slow enough and steadily that I felt, okay, if I just focus entirely on tennis, I think things could ramp up quickly. So basically, and this was 2010, I decide, okay, I'm going to go for the London 2012 Paralympics. I told my employer my plan. I had asked for support. Unfortunately, they didn't want to treat me any differently from, another employee. And why would they? Because, they, weren't exactly an Olympic sponsor or anything like that. So I had to take a leave of absence. And so I took a leave of absence in March 2011. And at the time, I was number 5 in Canada outside the top 100 players in the world. In order to qualify for the London 2012 Paralympics, I had to get to the top 46 in the world and number 1 in Canada. And I immediately, within a week of me leaving my job, I went to Puerto Rico, won a tournament, which was great. But then I noticed I was just not fit, and I struggled, and I basically wasn't selected to go to the World Team Cup, which is basically, if you know tennis, it's like the Davis Cup or the Fed Cup equivalent for wheelchair tennis. They selected 4 players ahead of me to go, and that was an eye-opening experience. So from that point on, I hired another tennis coach. I worked with a mental trainer. I basically treated every day like a full-time job. Like, get up, go to the gym. Let's do 2-a-days, on the tennis court. Let's take naps. Let's eat properly. Let's get really fit. And I think I bulked up. I gained more energy. And by that summer, I rose to number 1 in Canada.
And how do the rankings work then? Like, every time you win, do you move up? Like, what has to happen? Because I imagine, apart from you finding success, the people ranked ahead of you have to find a lack of success or failure.
I think it's interesting because the tennis rankings fluctuate every week. It's a cumulative ranking structure in that it's based over a 52-week tennis season. And that's the crazy thing about our sport, is that it's played every month. Almost every week at some point in the year, it's played somewhere in the world. And
so you have to make your own off season.
So yes, exactly. So you have to basically strategize that the rankings are based off of your best 9 tournaments. What if you don't do well in 9 of them? Or you have to go to 15 then, do you understand? Like, so
I see what you're saying.
They
like
take your best 9 tournaments. So if I went to 20, that gives me a way better shot to have my best 9 results, because I can have a few throwaway tournaments in Alabama or in California or in England, knowing that I've done really well in Turkey, South Africa, so you really have to look at, the allotted points in a given tournament. And again, rankings are very complicated. So it also depends on the level of the tournament. So if I was to win the US Open, I would get a ton of points. But if I won a tournament in Windsor, I'm not going to get as many points, obviously.
While this is all happening, one thing I really find fascinating is you and I both grew up with social media in our personal lives, just as personal accounts that we use to share things with people, to interact with them. And then in 2011, I guess when you make this jump in your tennis career, you start to become a bit of your own brand at the beginning. So how did you kind of juggle that a bit?
Obviously, Twitter, when it came about, I was just interested in learning about the latest trades that happened in baseball. That's what I use Twitter for. And but I think as an amateur athlete, you start realizing that things like Twitter, Instagram, creating your own blogs or websites, they can actually help you elevate your brand, which is incredibly important, because sponsorship is important for an athlete. I mean, to break it down, Victor, we would get $18,000 from the Canadian government. That's through Sport Canada. I would get an additional $6,000 from the Quest for Gold Lottery Fund, which is the Ontario government, through the OLG. I would also get some funding through Tennis Canada for coaching and tournaments and other expenses. And then you'd have a bit of prize money, not nearly enough. And basically after that, you're on your own. If I'm playing 18 tournaments in 2011 and 20 in 2012, there's absolutely no way that I'm going to be able to fund myself. So I think I started realizing, it was important for me to build my brand and what I value and what companies would value. And that's why I started to really focus more on the social media aspect of it.
Did you have a moment, though, where you're on, say, Twitter or Facebook? We'll pick on Twitter because I know that's a much more wide open platform, where you started to notice all of a sudden people following you, and you looked at the people following you and you said, okay, these people seem to be more interested in Joel Dembe, the athlete, rather than just Joel Dembe, the baseball fan, talking about trades.
Well, I think the one thing I realized that most of my followers on Twitter, I had met them. Like, we had connected or networked at some event or done something together, whether it was through the tennis community or whether it was through the disability community. I feel like they wanted to follow me for my results. And I think the one interesting thing about wheelchair tennis is that at the time, it's getting better now with Tennis Canada supporting wheelchair tennis initiatives a little bit more. But it would be hard for someone like you to follow, how I'm doing in Britain or how I'm doing at a tournament, halfway across the world. So what I would do is I would continually update my progress and build to something, the momentum towards London, and say the journey towards the London 2012 games, and make it sort of like a story.
And while you were playing then, did you have someone live tweeting your results?
Absolutely not. No,
No,
it was always me. No, I didn't go that far. I do know that there are certain people and that give over their Twitter account to a company or a media, or and I'm sure you know a little bit more about this.
Or just hand a phone to a family member and say, just don't say anything offensive.
My family members know nothing about Twitter. They're very old school when it comes to most of that stuff. So it was mostly me controlling the media.
But you bring up an interesting point when you said that there was a lack of coverage of wheelchair tennis and people had to gravitate towards you to find it. You kind of unofficially wore the hat of journalist for your sport, where you were reporting on it. Not many outlets or not many athletes can say that per se.
Well, I think when you play an amateur sport and one that is unique, like wheelchair tennis, whether it's wheelchair tennis or pentathlon, you have to sort of you have to be an advocate for your sport. And I think that's so important, because I think we're in a position, and I say this amongst all the wheelchair tennis players in Canada, we're in a position to promote physical activity. And I kind of saw the big picture in it. I didn't just see it as, oh, I won at this really small tournament in Vancouver or won in Quebec City. Like, nobody, to be honest, there's not many people other than, people cheering for Canadian tennis that really care about the day-to-day results. They want to hear more about what the story is. What you're doing some incredible things in a wheelchair, Joel. Look at what you're promoting. You're promoting physical activity, adversity, all these things that are great for kids to learn about, great for adults. And I felt like that was the big picture. I felt like just being part of the grassroots tennis community, and tennis can be played by anyone. That's something that I really felt like was more important than my day-to-day, week-to-week results on the competitive tennis scene.
So which social media platform did you find was most effective in communicating that message?
For sure, Twitter, because the Canadian Paralympic Committee started getting really active in Twitter as I started joining Twitter. And so basically they would promote things and I would do images. And so there'd be a lot of back and forth between the CPC, CBC Sports is very active on Twitter, myself, Tennis Canada, Ontario Wheelchair Sports Association, the OTA, Ontario Tennis Association. There's lots of NSOs that are actively pursuing the online social media to promote tennis. And I think that's something that I was a part of.
And do you have to get any media training when you start to get to that level about how to deal with reporters, how to handle your social media account, or was it kind of like you just figuring it out as you go along?
That's funny because I had that similar question, Joel. Have you had media training? Because
Because absolutely, you sound like you've had media training.
I hadn't.
Apart from a number of interviews, I'm sure you've given as well as experience.
I think it just progressed over time because as you started doing a little better, whether it was on the tennis court or, professionally, I just was able to talk to more people. And whether it was, getting coverage in the Toronto Star or appearing on Canada AM, I just kind of picked it up. And, the only media training I had is for my current position. And it was honestly a great learning experience for me to just get a little bit of it. But I think it's something that I sort of developed naturally over time.
That is a perfect segue. Wanted to ask you next, now that you're retired, what are you up to now?
Well, during the retirement process, I kind of knew sort of the direction I was going to be headed, and that was to, get back into the working world. And I felt like the RBC Olympians program was the best way for me to do that. RBC already being a sponsor of the Canadian Olympic Committee, they've sponsored, the Olympic movement in Canada since 1947. I felt it would be good for my brand. I felt I could, be a good asset to the RBC team. So it's been a really cool thing. And basically you act as a community ambassador for RBC, and you work with a lot of amateur athletic groups, but you also gain valuable working experience too in an office. And I'm able to work downtown Toronto now in marketing and sponsorship, and get back to sort of the skills that I was gaining in my old life before tennis came along, obviously.
The Olympics and the Paralympics are coming up in Rio this summer. Will we see you back there? Obviously not playing, but in some capacity for Tennis Canada?
Oh, I mean, if anything, I want to promote a lot of the tennis players that are going to be going to the games, and obviously, hopefully, shine a positive light on the games, because I mean, all you hear is negativity. And I can tell you, when you're an athlete, you have to ignore it. You have to sort of just do what you need to do to get the job done on the tennis court. And I think I'll try to hopefully provide a more positive light on the games, because obviously there's been nothing but controversy surrounding the venues and sites like that. So it's been, and you have to face that.
Brazil's taken a bit of a kicking. They even had that controversy 2 years ago leading up to the World Cup, whether or not that stadia would be completed. So we'll have to wait and see what happens there. Joel, thanks so much for this. Really appreciate it. I'm going to close with the same question I ask everyone. If you weren't in media or doing anything within marketing, what do you think you'd be up to?
I've done a lot. I've worked in the financial sector. I've given lots of interviews. I've done blogs. I've done all these things. I think I'm pretty much doing what I want to do right now. But if I had none of this, if I didn't have wheelchair tennis, if I didn't have the need to be active and the want and desire to do that, maybe like a race car driver. I think I've always liked doing things fast, and I know you and I like a little bit about talking about the sports car industry, but it would be nice to be a race car driver.
Awesome. Joel, thanks a lot for your time today.
Thank you.
That's it for today's show. For more episodes, you can go to soundcloud.com/mediapeoplepodcast or subscribe on your favorite podcast service like Apple Podcasts or CastBox. And don't forget to follow me on Instagram at VicGenova.